Thanks, Simon. Afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Yeah, as Simon says, it's a meaty topic. I'm a planning consultant by trade. I'm a director at McLaughlin Planning. So I've been working in planning just coming up to just a little over 10 years now. And yeah, I had the pleasure of working on a lot of listed buildings over the years, and joining and working with excellent people in the profession, like the likes of Katie and Emma, for example, in that sort of sector. The sort of context of this is it kind of came around from sort of conveniently in January, the guidance document being issued by the government, sort of talking about the importance of retrofitting listed buildings and the challenges that come with it. And unsurprisingly, at the top of the list of problems was planning, and the issues that come with the inconsistencies and costs and time constraints that often come with that process in trying to retrofit. Now, I guess sort of just reveling in the moment, in this moment in time, actually why it's important. We're talking about, as Simon said, an awful lot of buildings. According to the sort of Historic England, we've got about approximately 500,000 listed buildings. I'm sure Katie and Emma might correct me on that, but from what I've seen, that's approximately the number of listed buildings we've got, and approximately 2.8 million properties that are in conservation areas. So if you're looking at that sort of context of buildings that will need to be retrofitted to ensure that we can hit our sustainability targets and tackle climate change, it's important that we understand the challenges that come with it, and ensure that property owners have the opportunity to have as clear and concise a process as possible to ensure that the buildings can be fitted in such a way that we can hit our sustainability targets and be more energy efficient. And yeah, the common hurdles being the sort of protraction of time, decision-making uncertainty, which is deterring stakeholders from actually getting involved, with evidence at the moment suggesting that last year around 27,000 listed building applications were submitted. So there's an awful lot of people doing it, and so actually understanding the topic is really important. And so hence today's discussion.
Marvellous. Thank you very much. Cheers, Chris. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Katie. I'm currently a team leader managing our London development advice team. So we deal with the planning applications and listed building consents, master planning policies, things like that at Historic England. I think I forgot to mention that.
I was going to say, yeah.
But yes, at Historic England. I've been there for about 7 years, and prior to that, I was in local authority in development management and conservation.
Cool. And last but not least, Emma.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I am a technical director and head of historic buildings at SLR Consulting, so technically a heritage consultant, I suppose. So we deal with everything to do with planning and development around historic buildings, everything from reporting for listed building consent, properties within conservation areas, even new builds as well, setting issues, etc. Listing enhancements, delistings, pretty much everything to do with historic buildings. And I've been doing this for about 15 years, was previously an academic teaching what I do now too. So yes, so that's me.
Cool, fantastic. Well, sounds like we've got the right people in the room to talk about this then. So, I mean, to start with, I mean, I think we'll end with what we plan to do as an industry and where we want to go and all of the things that we can do. But at the moment, I suppose when the things that does come to mind when we talk about trying to retrofit some of these heritage buildings are the challenges. So what are the most common challenges that you face? What are the barriers, and where are these the main pinch points, and can we see a route through them?
It's a big question, isn't it? Picking up from the planning side, it's often, as planning professionals, certainly when you come out of university and you're coming into the sector, we're often not trained in understanding heritage assets. And so we rely heavily on our colleagues in the heritage sector, be it heritage officers or heritage consultants, to guide us. And so I think often when we have individuals come to us as planning consultants or planning officers with a listed building which they're trying to retrofit, and it can be something even as minor as or small as maybe saying, oh, I want to put additional glazing in, for example, or I just want to do something to make my home or business more energy efficient. The question often is, well, actually, it's almost an art form rather than a science in actually understanding, is this something that needs consent, or is this something that you could do without needing any form of permission? And as a planner, the first thing we tend to do is go, right, are there any permitted development rights? What's the policy on it? How do we approach it from that planning mindset? Often forgetting that we need to work in parallel and in conjunction with our heritage colleagues on these things. Sort of unfortunately or fortunately, one of the key constraints of that is because it's more of this subjectivity and art form, is that the guidance from local authorities is often limited. Historic England does provide some really useful guidance for us to sort of use as a starting point. But when you go down, sort of delve down into each of the local authorities, aside from maybe conservation area appraisals, the actual approach to how you deal with listed buildings is often limited. And so that engagement and communication with the council is often challenging. Yeah, if you're a stakeholder, someone who owns a building, and you're trying to sort of tackle that process, it can be very overwhelming. You're sort of met with this wall of, well, grey answers without really that sort of black and white. There are examples of really good ones. For example, Westminster Council, I know, has a really good retrofit historic buildings guide, which sort of walks people through what you can and can't do for certain types of retrofit, be it insulation, fitting windows, solar panels, air source heat pumps, all the sort of things that you can think of to that side of things. But it's not commonplace, and I think that's often the challenge, certainly from the planning side, on where do you start? Yeah, I'm not sure if Emma and Katie would agree with that, but that's certainly how it feels from the planner's mindset.
Yeah, I think when it comes to challenges, where do you begin? I could do a whole hour on this, I think, because as you've touched upon, there really is there's just inconsistencies, not only in local authorities and the decision making when it comes to whether something will not require listed building consent, but whether it will be approved or not. But in terms of the regional and national policy, there just isn't a guidebook, if we want to call it, a rule book either. And the NPPF is extremely broad. Of course, Historic England have great guidance, but a lot of this is just guidance. But I think this also stems from the fact that these are our challenges, of course, and then applying it when we're looking at making alterations to buildings. But if you're a listed building homeowner, for example, what is retrofitting? What are we classing as retrofitting? And then we have to look at the fact that every single building should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Every single historic building is its own fabric. It might have some fabric from the 18th century, some fabric from the 17th, 19th. They all work differently. It's been altered over time. So you cannot apply a blanket policy, really. I think this is really difficult because everything must be a sort of case-by-case but holistic approach to a building. And I think that's why we're sort of in this limbo stage at the moment. Where do we go from here? Really is the question I have. I don't know, but I think the main challenge is just inconsistency across the board. So I'd be interested in Katie's response, actually, then coming from that angle.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a huge number of inconsistencies, right from, you touched on definitions. Everyone has different understandings. Is retrofit even the right word for what we're really talking about? Yeah. I think there's a huge opportunity for policy to really come into its own here. I think we could be really progressive in how policy is produced, adding the really detailed guidance for people, really focusing on, local authorities really focusing on understanding what building stock they have and providing tailored guidance to that. So owners aren't having to replicate that every single time, taking typology-based, construction-based approaches based on what they have in their local authority areas. I've been working with Westminster quite a lot on their work, and they're doing a fantastic job and really taking it seriously and coming out to produce a lot of detailed guidance, which is really helpful. I think, again, the big question is, where do people start? And I think this also relates into the skills gap that we have. Who do people go to for these sorts of things in their number one instance? There is unfortunately going to be a lag there. We need to train people up to understand these sorts of things, but that is certainly a huge barrier. There are inconsistencies in planning authority decisions. I think that comes from a range of issues, from confidence of officers to officers having the right correct information in front of them to allow them to make a positive decision. I think there needs to be a bit of a culture change in terms of, we don't know really what works. There is unfortunately going to be a period of trial and error. So So long as people have shown we've gone through the right approach, we've followed these reasonable steps, this is the answer we've got to based on our understanding of significance and what we want out of retrofit. This is what we think the carbon calculations will be. And then the local authorities meeting them halfway going, right, that's enough. You've certainly based this on understanding of heritage. Maybe that's enough at this stage. So there are issues there. As well as trade skills, I'm coming across gaps in more professional skills as well. There aren't very many conservation architects. There aren't loads of consultation heritage consultants. There's a bit of a gap in the legal side of things. I don't want to jump ahead and talk about listed building consent orders or heritage partnership agreements, but I'm working with a few organisations who are setting those up, but the blockage then is getting the legal expertise out there to tie that up legally. That's become a bit of a barrier. The other thing I've noticed, particularly in the big cities, is that an awful lot of the historic housing stock has been converted into flats. And then you're coming across the ownership issues there. Because it's a whole building, you need everybody to buy into it and everyone to want to do the works and contribute to the works at the same time. And there's all sorts of leaseholder, freeholder issues there, which is another barrier. So yeah, there's quite a lot there. I don't know. I'll put it in the chat, actually. I don't know if you've seen the government's energy efficiency review of barriers, but I'll drop it in the chat so people can look at that.
So who's the kingpin here then? Who's the overriding with all these challenges? And I get what Emma's saying about that these buildings are all completely different, and it's difficult to have like a broad stroke, broad brush, quick fix to any of this. But who is leading the way? Who's, like, if you're Historic England, are you advising the government, or are you advising the planning authorities? And who is leading who here?
I'll jump in first and then pass over. Yes, so we are the government's advisors. So we advise government. We are statutory consultees in local authority policy making and plan making as well. So we're advising them. And then we've also produced a huge room of technical guidance to help advise the sector, installers, professionals, things like that. So we're trying to cover all the bases. I think one of the things that's really important is to, obviously we're here to talk about heritage, but the approach to how you retrofit your historic building is going to be fairly similar. Even, you want to install something that's going to work, which means you need to understand what you have. So that's going to be the case across the board with any building. It's just once you get to a listed building, for example, or a building in a conservation area, that level of understanding of significance and performance comes in, because all the fabric's going to perform differently. But you want to understand the interaction of what you're doing and what that might have on what you've got to avoid maladaptation. I think that's probably the number one message on that, and that's the message we're trying to get across to people.
And then you mentioned earlier on about retrofit. I mean, it's just leading on from what you've just said, but I mean, if retrofit isn't the right word, is there a right word? What?
Well, sorry, Emma.
No, I was just thinking I suppose the word is making historic fabric more sustainable, I suppose, because I suppose any change that we make really in many ways is retrofitting to historic buildings. So it is a bit of a blanket term, but just going back to what you were saying, Katie, I think you pick up on a good point too, and we've seen this as well, is the kind of skills gap and who's leading whom is a lot of the issue, because where does the buck lie? And the problem we are finding is going back to this all being case by case. And as you say, but we need something more overarching. And I agree with that. But what we're finding is a lot of sort of passive house or retrofitters that will deal with new builds are then trying to apply that to historic fabric. And as you say, at the moment, we don't know what's going to happen. you know, Historic Environment Scotland, for example, they've done a lot of great case studies to practically, and we're starting to see how retrofitting measures have interacted with the fabric. However, we still don't know. You know, this is only a few years. We're not looking 20, 40, 100, etc. years in the future. And how are the measures that we are implementing, everything from air source heat pumps to our insulation to windows, etc., how are these going to actually impact, and with climate change itself, on this fabric? That's the issue, and that's why I think the skills gap is another huge issue that we're dealing with, because there's a difference between really an historic buildings retrofitter, if we want to call it that, or conservation retrofitter, and a modern retrofitter that's all round. And I think that's really important to stress.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And, you know, I think coming back to the question of what's the starting point and who's the kingpin really of the decision-making process. I mean, for the lifespan of a planning or listed building consent application, you know, so I think often when we get approached by owners of listed buildings, the starting point often from the planner's mindset is, okay, I need to really understand the fabric of this building and understand what your aspirations are and what's your budget, you know, to really just understand everything. You know, what's your budget? What are you looking to accomplish? What's the long-term goal here? How does this all work within the fabric and the historical significance of the building? And those are the sort of initial conversation and questions that I think need to be answered before you even go any further than that. Once you then get to, certainly from our side as planners, again, that sort of almost deer in headlights moment of going, right, I need to get a heritage consultant or speak with the heritage officer at the council, really get my head around this. And sort of talking about skills side of things, it's unfortunately the case that with many local authorities, it's people over policy, in the sense of that you're almost dealing with the training and the personality of that specific local authority's conservation team, rather than necessarily the consistency across each local authority. So often working with landowners, the conversation is, right, I know who that officer is and I know how they deal with it. And so which doesn't feel quite right. It often feels like that shouldn't be the way to do it. It should be really more consistently about looking at the interest of the building and its long-term preservation, but you're often having a sort of maneuver around the individual. So that's how it sort of comes across as a planner. I think the challenge with submitting these applications and why it's so important to understand which local authority you're working with is because also that personality from the planning application listed building consent side is often made by a planning officer. So it's not made by the heritage officer who's doing their role in advising them. And so you're often finding that the planning officers who are no fault of their own, not trained necessarily to the full extent in that area other than experience, are often just taking everything by the letter of what that heritage officer is telling them, rather than looking at it more holistically as they're sort of meant to for the purposes of planning decision making. So in advising people on what to do as the starting point, who the kingpin or the sort of key assets or persons to speak to, I think it's really balancing and making that decision of, right, is this getting advice on, is this the right time to go directly to the local authority to talk to the heritage officer there through pre-application or initial engagement with the local authority on the project? Or is it a case of getting a heritage consultant who knows the local area and understands the types of asset that you own in first to make sure that you're getting the advice you need before you take that next step? Because, you know, the challenge often is, you know, often we find that we get a call from someone who's submitted 3 or 4 listed building consent applications. They're all getting refused. And you actually look at it and it's actually quite an easy fix. And it's just because that conversation needs to happen with the right people. So I think that would be how it's sort of through the lens of a planner, that's how it sort of looks. And so in terms of the sort of definition of retrofit, certainly, yeah, I don't think there's a sort of neat definition for it. I think retrofits probably seems to be the term applied to most guidance documents. So for anyone looking for the right guidance, I know Historic England, Katie might correct me on this, but I think Historic England has called it the retrofit guidance document for historic buildings, which is a useful starting point as well to sort of to have a look at what you can do. So I think hence the terminology. And I think what's really important is retrofit is often seen as, well, it's almost like looking at it like a classic car, like fixing it and going, oh, I need to do it because otherwise the building won't run. Well, it's it's beyond that. Actually, it benefits the asset long term. You know, we're looking at it both from the historic and sustainability point of view. These are assets we want to keep. We're really privileged in this country to have such a wonderful collection of listed and historic buildings. And so it's not the intention of retrofit, if you're a listed building owner or working on a listed building, is that, yes, we're trying to make sure these buildings function for the long term as well. So it's really important. And I mean, a good example of that is, you know, you look at the London market, for example. Commercial buildings, often office buildings, for example, from speaking to the likes of Knight Franks, for example, I think they released a report sort of advising that most buildings need to be sort of EPC rating A or B to just get an interest basically from the market, because people are being much more conscious about the sustainability of buildings. And so if you're looking to rent or sort of own a listed building, seeing that EPC rating and sort of seeing what you could do with it is you know, often in the forefront of most people's minds, and hence getting the right heritage advice is so important.
But just picking up on that before we, sorry, but in terms of the EPC ratings, at what point are there, what's the word? Sorry, not, I'm going to say get out, which obviously isn't the right word, but what is, because at some point, if you have to spend so much money or you're looking to do, you don't have to, do you? Exemption, sorry, that was the word. Yeah, so how do exemptions fit into this? And also just what's interesting, when we have like previous webinars and people are talking about calculations for embodied carbon and whole life carbon, etc., it's based on sort of a 60-year life cycle of a property. I mean, the property in the image from Emma, backshot. I mean, what's that? How old is that property? 300? Well, you obviously the castle that's many hundreds of years old, but then the house is going to be 3. So it's amazing how long these buildings do last. And picking up on your point, Chris, you know, we're trying to ensure that they last not forever, but for as long as they can.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, and on the 60-year side of things, I believe that's, I mean, the architects in the chat would probably know this better than I do, so I'll be careful what I say, but it's I think it's to do with guidance from REBA, I believe it was. I was at a talk recently from REBA where that was talked about, and yeah, it just feels a lot of the retrofitting side feels quite experimental. I think Katie touched on that at the moment, and in many ways that's actually really exciting. I kind of, you see the technology that we're getting and coming forward, and there's a lot of things that can actually come into making retrofitting sort of efficient or work much better in a way that is both for the benefit of sustainability and listed buildings. I'm aware, I believe Charlie Luxton, who gave a talk recently for REBA in Gloucestershire, was talking about you know, looking at opportunities to put secondary glazing in such a way that it's almost doesn't damage or touch the fabric of the listed building. It almost sort of sits on it. And so there might be a way to sort of protect the asset whilst also ensuring the building can retain heat better. So, and that's a technology I think that he's exploring at the moment. So there's all these things out there that can be really good to listed buildings, but the starting point has to be is the conversation between heritage and the built environment in terms of the sector, for both from an architect's and planner's perspective, to make sure that we can work collectively on it. And I think coming back to the sort of introduction to this, certainly from the planning side, I feel personally that the planning sort of sits in isolation. It does need to have a wider conversation and much more engagement with other sectors like the historic environment to make sure that people are professionally trained in understanding these buildings.
Can I just make a point about EPCs as well, because I think that's a really important one. They don't really work as an assessment tool. I think everyone accepts that it's a massively flawed process. So we've been, you know, trying to push for a sort of more of a building passport type system, because, you know, for example, the current EPC assessing tools, their database of materials is very small and they don't predict accurate values from anything pre-1965, for example. So that doesn't help historic buildings, and they start from scratch every single time and only assess, you know, they can only assess what they see, things like that. So that is a big stumbling block as well. So trying to improve that environmental assessment methodology would be really, really helpful going forward.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, Katie. No,
Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the sort of gold standard is not EPC, but particularly so when we're looking at historic buildings, and it just doesn't really work. Hence why there is the exemption process. for listed buildings, particularly when it comes to landlords, etc., because it is such an antiquated system that's sort of fabric first, and it's just an interesting system that needs to be overhauled in order to put retrofitting of historic fabric right at the heart of, you know, our sustainability challenges. And this is one issue. And I think it actually also goes in tandem with the cost of all this. You know, we started with the challenges of retrofitting, but that is one other issue. I know that's an issue anyway when it comes to listed buildings often, but ideally you would want some sort of thermo-imaging done, some sort of energy assessment if you have an historic building, in order to then determine what retrofitting measures are going to work and are going to be helpful for that particular fabric. But all of this, it is certainly a process, and it's not something that I think all homeowners, all listed building owners, planners, consultants, etc., are really aware of. It's not just a one-size-fits-all, let's stick an air source heat pump, let's stick secondary glazing in. I have my own issues with secondary glazing, but I won't get into them. But, you know, it again goes back to, we have to look at the building. And I think that's what's really key, which is why the expertise really has to be at the forefront of this, that, you know, when the planners come along and there is a development that includes retrofitting, get the heritage consultants on board, you know, as early as possible, because you might want to do X, Y, and Z. However, that doesn't mean it'll be particularly right for that building. For example, and let's just say the M&S decision recently is one example of just, you know, how woolly perhaps the MPPF is when it comes to retrofitting too. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And, you know, there's other, you know, things like the M&S decision and other decisions. This is not so much for maybe listed buildings, but even like in conservation areas, you know, there's a lot of homeowners who say, well, you know, and sort of almost naively say, well, can't I knock a bit of it down? Because ultimately the replacement of it is going to save me the VAT. And you're like, oh God, well, trying to explain that one and say, well, you can't start doing that is often a big challenge. And, you know, as you say, it's just about the education of understanding your building. And getting heritage involved from the get-go is so important. And certainly that helps the planning side, because, you know, like you were saying with the EPC comments, you know, I think the fact is the planners look at it in the sense of, as a sort of blunt instrument, they look at it as, well, we need to look at, that's the tool we've got, this is what we can use to assess the building, so that's what we're going to use. But as Katie and Emma said, you know, that's not the right tool from the heritage side of things. So educating the authority and the homeowner throughout the whole process is really important, because it benefits the homeowner, the home in the long term, and also means hopefully that the right decisions come out from local authorities as well, because they can see the process that has gone through to get to that position. And I think what you're saying earlier about the technology of actually assessing your building, understanding where's the heat actually going out or coming out from, and what bits need to be insulated or what bits need to be changed to make this building more energy efficient is such a great way to start that process.
Yeah, and actually you just picked up on a good point, because really we look at air infiltration in historic buildings rather than escaping too. So, you know, it's silly things like that. But yeah, there are so many issues that we're still facing to sort of plug these gaps. But you mentioned VAT as well, and actually reducing VAT might help with retrofitting as a whole, and, you know, landlords, etc., and owners refurbing and retrofitting the historic stock that they have. So that's just an interesting point to bring up too.
Absolutely. I think one question actually I have almost for Katie, I guess, from Historic England side, but also just, well, more generally as well, I think, is whether or not there's any benefit in local authorities being much more proactive in adopting things like local listed building consent orders, for example, as a way to help homeowners and commercial building owners in supporting retrofitting. Because I'm only aware of 2 local authorities I can think of that have, one who's in the process of doing it. I think that's Chelsea and Kensington, and the other is I think Brent or Barnet, I think it was, who've got one adopted for one of their conservation areas. So whether or not that helps is, I think, worth discussing as well.
Yeah, so Kensington have 2 that are up and running, one for solar panels and one for window, you know, double glazing. And secondary glazing, and Bath are in the process of putting one together as well. And various other councils have been in touch to explore the idea. I think they're a fabulous way of doing it. I really hope they can be used more. They need the stumbling block though is they need to be genuinely helpful. So they need to be I think the best ones are typology based or area by area based. The blanket ones don't work because you end up needing to put so many conditions on the order that it doesn't really help owners because they still end up having to submit a whole lot of details, hire someone to draw up the plans for them, all the rest of it, and still submit an application. So that isn't helping owners at all, and it isn't helping the local authority because they're still dealing with applications. And the point is to reduce applications. So having a really well-crafted, well-evidenced LBCO, which has detail on the face of it, so an owner can go, right, that's how I do it. If they want to do it differently, they can, but they just apply for consent as they normally would. But at least this is an approved methodology, an approved installation method for the buildings that are covered by the order, so people can just crack on and do that. So I think well-crafted, detailed, worded right, and evidence, they could be really, really good tools. And then heritage partnership agreements are similar. It's that they're produced by the applicant or the owner. So a lot of the estate owners are exploring those. Harrods, Liberties, shopping places like that, they're exploring them. So it's a similar blanket consent, but from the applicant side rather than the local authority side. So these are working really, really well and can work really well. But that's where I've been experiencing some of the legal problems and getting those absolutely tidied up. But yeah, in theory, absolutely brilliant.
Just jumping in, just Ryan asked a question which Paul's responded to on the chat, but I don't know whether you guys have. Ryan's asking, is the use of BIM technology being fully utilised within the heritage sector? I presume it's not being fully utilised, but Emma, have you come across people using BIM?
Not that I'm aware of. Katie, can you add?
Yeah, there's been some research going on about it recently, and it was really popular for a while, but it seems to have sort of fallen off the radar a little bit. We've got a couple of documents on it that I can drop in the chat, so it is something that we have looked at in the past. But as I said, it's sort of fallen off the agenda and the discussion point a little bit. I'm not sure why, but certainly that would be a really useful way of trying to monitor what's happening, which is really crucial given that we don't really know how all of these things are going to play out. So that's why having that monitoring data to know, so we can constantly adapt and evolve to what we're doing, is really helpful. I'll just put these in the chat.
Cool, thank you. And then Katie, I mean, internally within Historic England, I mean, how much are you battling with the conservationists, you know, with your sustainability hat on? I mean, what's the narrative within your organisation, and are you sort of pushing uphill? Are you? What's the score there? How are their attitudes adapting?
I think everyone is largely on the same page that, you know, if we can't adapt our buildings, they won't exist. There won't be a use for them. And we've constantly adapted buildings because we're still using them when they're hundreds, thousands of years old. So we have always been adapting them. It's just continuing to adapt them in a sensitive way so they continue to exist. As I said, if you maladapt them, that's when you're starting to look at loss of fabric and failure, which is as bad as climate change vulnerabilities attacking them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're very supportive of retrofit. I think most of the sector are as well. But it's trying to give local authority officers the tools and confidence that they need to make these positive decisions. What we've done is we've written a guidance document that we consulted on just before Christmas on climate change, which is intended to do exactly that, provide a bit more of a direction and give our view on things. We received a lot of consultation responses, so we're going through those and then we'll have a final version. We also had a listed building consent guidance document, which sort of highlights the sorts of things you can do without consent. as well to try and help people crack on and do things. But I wouldn't say it's an uphill struggle. I would say there's just a frustration with the skills gap, really. I think that's what it comes down to.
And then Chris, Emma, I mean, from a homeowner perspective, you know, if there's a narrative is changing within the government and the planning authorities in historic England, previously when people have been looking to adapt or improve their listed building, their heritage building, it may have been because of cosmetic reasons. And now when people are coming to you, are they thinking more about energy efficiency and they're wanting to make changes to their you know, to provide low carbon heating methods, etc.? Is that you see more of an uptake in the change from homeowners and property owners?
I would say definitely, but also as well, depending on what their proposed changes might be, it can be used as a bit of a sweetener, i.e. a public benefit, if there is going to be any harm on the fabric. And we would always push for it, actually. You know, if you're doing a big conversion or some sort of adaptation to an historic fabric, we will be saying to the client, what sustainable measures are you implementing? Are you going to be looking at retrofitting? How are you heating this? Have you looked at this? Have you looked at this? So in fact, we are also recommending this as much as we can, not only to help them get through, but also because that's what they should be doing. And it's an opportunity. So actually, development is becoming an opportunity to ensure that our historic fabric is more sustainable.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's very much almost most calls I have with building owners who have just bought or in the process of recently moved into listed buildings, for example, or like, well, we're really excited, this is our new home, but we need to make sure it's really energy efficient, and we want to make sure that this is a home we can stay in for, you know, the long term and make it work for us. And you know, it's partly the financial side, but I think a lot of people now have the environmental side of it right in the forefront of their mind when they look at these buildings. And so, yeah, I think Emma's hit the nail on the head, you know, using the sustainability side as a tool to try and balance that versus the heritage considerations is such a great way to do it. And it helps with also just, you know, trying to sort of, you know, taking the things we've just spoken about with regards to looking at the building and actually understanding the asset, using it as a tool to say, well, actually, if we do this, this building will, you know, could last another, you know, God knows how many years, basically, and you know, it will actually run and be an efficient building. And I think, as Katie said, it's not trying to find sort of, in inverted commas, cheap quick wins that aren't actually doing the building any favor or actually doing the owner any favor. You know, it's one of those that you buy cheap, buy twice sort of situations. It's actually do it right from the get-go, get the right team involved, make sure you're doing the building justice, but also something that is going to tick all the boxes to make sure that you've got a building that works in the long term. And you know, a key starting part of the conversation with landowners or property owners is what's your, you know, how much do you want to budget for this? Is this something you're looking at? Is it a long-term project? Or is this something you're just looking to sort of fix things in small areas? Trying to really gauge the scale of this, and that will also influence how you approach it then from a heritage and planning perspective.
Cool. Tobias has just made the point that you made earlier when you were setting out the context, Chris, about how they've come across a lot of listed building officers who feel a historic building is like a museum and it just can't be touched regardless.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we get that a lot. Yeah, you know, you so much as scratch the paintwork, it's considered something that's going to be a great upset. And I think that's why, you know, working with, certainly from a planner's mindset, our advice is always very much a case of get someone with heritage experience on your side, work together, provide the evidence. It's all about the evidence. It's trying to almost combat that subjectivity and that mindset of going, well, look, here's the historical record, and here's how we're managing that with in the context of the sustainability requirements that we're looking to accomplish with retrofitting this building, because it just makes it's trying to sort of demonstrate that you're not just coming into this without any thought, basically. And I think that's often the challenge when you're dealing with. It comes back to that people over policy situation of, well, if that's the mindset, how do you address that, and asking the right questions?
Yeah, we don't want anything to be a relic. That doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't serve the building. Equally, though, if someone wants to propose something to the most significant part of the building, they're going to come up with the problem. But at the same time, there's, you know, we really don't want these buildings to, as I said, be relics or museums. It's really important that they continue to contribute and be used and looked after.
Yeah, that's right. We're not trying to preserve anything in aspic. We realise, and change doesn't equal harm. I think that's the key thing here. But we do, we find a lot with local authorities that there is a lot of inconsistencies, and just any change to a listed building can be an uphill battle, no matter how much you've outlined the significance or lack thereof. So that's exactly what we're here for. But it doesn't mean that there isn't difficulties, and a lot of this comes out, I think, from the fact that there is this skills gap and this expertise and this sort of a fear of making a decision that may be seen as wrong or incorrect. So yeah, this is a particularly challenging situation at the moment for retrofitting.
I completely agree. I think that you've hit the nail on the head. It's that fear and caution. It's they're taking the cautious route. And I think that's the same with the planning officers, the inexperienced, and often inexperienced, I should say, but training is very much take the cautious route, to play it safe, because they just want to make sure that they're not making any mistakes, which is obviously from a heritage asset a good thing. You don't want to make a mistake and damage the building, but that's why the evidence, I feel, is always so important, because you're giving them that reassurance that everything has been done to consider this building, and hopefully sort of ease that caution slightly in making decisions.
Not always the case, but
not always the case, but yeah, it's that's where the training side of it comes into it. And I think, as a panel had spoken about before, certainly I'm of the view that there needs to be more training earlier on, certainly with planning officers, and that being for both for the private and public sector, to sort of make sure that we're trained in understanding these assets, and the value and the importance of how you approach it, because that's the only way we can be able to sort of consistently make sure that there's better action taken when retrofitting.
I think that fear thing is really important, because when you're a local authority officer, no matter what you decide, you've really upset somebody, which can make you very risk averse. Because if you approve something, someone will ring you up and accuse you of cultural vandalism, and if you approve if you refuse something, the owner is accusing you of blocking climate change progress and all the rest of it. So they are in a tricky position. So I think allowing them to let go of that fear, and as you said, making really good, having the evidence there to allow them to go, right, that's how to come up with that answer, and to have really good policies that direct them to come to the right answer, to a positive solution. Because policies are supposed to be written in a very unambiguous way, so it's clear as to how a decision maker is supposed to react. And I think then if we can start getting those written correctly, it might help bring people along. But yeah, there's definitely a bit of a culture change needed. It's sort of like any industry, really. You have people that are very what's the word? Fixed in a certain view, and need to take a wider view as well.
I was just going to try and move on in the last 10 minutes or so to focus on the opportunities and where we can go with this. And obviously we've mentioned about reducing that when it comes to retrofitting, etc. But but equally I want to address what people are actually asking in the room. So David's just again, he's just sort of mirroring and repeating what others have said, just in terms of their experience with local authorities, not particularly positive when it comes to looking at listed buildings. And he's asking, will this situation change in the future? Because some people are going to want to live in a listed building just because they want to live in a listed building, and but will that number of people reduce, and what happens to them if we don't adapt? Or
your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
I think actually the fallout from the M&S decision is quite crucial here, because I do think that we are going to get better policy as a result. We're going to have to, so we'll probably have a new MPPF soon. But I think in terms of retrofitting, if we do get some sort of more national guidance, that will help too. But it also goes back to exactly what Katie was saying. If it's not implemented, though, That's the issue. And if it's not implemented properly, then it doesn't really matter how much policy we have and guidance coming out of our ears. So I think actually this is a bit of a skills crisis too, and experience crisis that needs to be addressed. And I have heard rumblings about this. I have heard rumblings that there is going to be a little bit more training in terms of conservation officers particularly. So yeah, I mean, doing it for 15 years, things have certainly changed from when I started. You would write a heritage statement for a listed building, consent. It would largely get through. You know, now it's quite rare sometimes that it'll get through compared to when it does, or things are far more difficult than they ever used to be. Sorry for the pessimism.
Just to finish, I mean, the last question I have really, and sort of Rob's picked up on it, but it's sort of, I suppose, if you're a homeowner, where do they go? Like Rob's mentioning whether you know, has 2030 frameworks, 2035, are they going to be useful? Should people be adopting those? What are Historic England doing that are helping owners of historic buildings to make their properties more energy efficient, sustainable, etc., less carbon intensive, etc. You know, and I think then there was going to be another session on the end of this, but just to sort of try and end with something that's, you know, showing how we can move forward would be quite helpful.
Yeah, I think if you're starting your journey, I think certainly our starting point tends to be looking at local authority guidance, seeing where the local authority's position is on the building. It might well be that the building itself has had historically applications associated with it, and you might find there's useful reports or decisions within it that helps to understand how that local authority is treating your building. And that's often a good starting point for sort of on the very local level. And obviously speaking to your friendly local heritage consultant or officer, if it's through pre-application, is always a good starting point. Certainly that's our advice from the planning side. And yeah, from a more guidance perspective, yeah, we certainly as planners, we like to go to the Historic England guidance, but also using let's say, referring to things like the individual local authorities guidance, like Westminster one that we spoke about earlier, or I know that other local authorities have produced good guidance documents to that effect to help understand what you can do to retrofit and alter your building. So that's, I think, a starting point from I think, actually, just on the question of what's it going to look like in the future on MSI, I'm a bit more of an optimist. I think I think technology and the way our industry is responding to trying to find new ways to create new building materials, or be it new methods of construction, are really exciting. Certainly hearing things at some build expos or speaking to people, architects, for example, in the industry, which in themselves, I think, will offer us hopefully some of the solutions that we're currently finding is the areas that we're grappling with often when it comes to listed building consent applications. I agree completely that the ultimate thorn in the side is the skill and training shortage side, and that's ultimately something that needs to be addressed. And that's certainly, I will keep shouting from the rooftops that needs to be something both from the planning and heritage side that we do better. But yeah, I think there's it's worth keeping an eye, I think, on how the industry is evolving and responding to using technology as a way, and new methods as a way to restore historic buildings on that question. Yeah,
and just to add as well, there's the Listed Property Owners Club, another great source of information if you are a homeowner particularly, and of course Historic England's guidance. But yes, we can refer people to past 2030, 2035, depending on what the property is. But it is a bit of a minefield, and particularly I know if I was a homeowner and didn't do what I do, would I know what to do? Perhaps not. So if it were I would probably go to the Listed Property Owners Club, get a consultant on board. You know, if it's grade 2 star, grade 1, then you would obviously confer with Historic England. But just going back to the basics and not trying to take it on yourself, I think, is probably the best advice I can give. Katie, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose as well, the thing I would say is understand the vulnerability that your property is facing, and think of it in the long term as well. You know, what the future of buildings in the climate in London is going to be different to living in Scotland, for instance. You're operating with different risks. Some places it's going to be flooding, other places it's going to be ground heave, other, overheating generally. So it's really, not taking a short-term view. You don't want to seal up your home and then, people end up dying of overheat, because that we're seeing that happen in France already. So look at what the vulnerabilities are that you're facing. Look at where the inefficiencies in your property lie. There's no point trying to insulate the walls when actually you're losing all of your heat through the floor. So try and target what it is you're doing, and understand the significance of what you have, and that will tell you where the sensitivities lie, and where you've got more scope for doing things. Yeah, I think that those would be the number one, along with what Emma and Chris has said. I think those would be the key things. But yeah, it is a bit of a minefield, and we want to be careful we don't want to oversaturate people with reams and reams of guidance. It is needed, however, but hopefully when we start to build up the skills in our industry, it'll make things a little bit smoother. But I would also echo Emma's point about the listed property owners club. Those sorts of places are really good sources of information, and to get connections and recommendations and things like that.
Cool. Marvelous. Thank you very much. I think, well, 12:59, we'll probably end it there, otherwise we'll go down another rabbit hole. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to speak with us today. Hell of a lot of information there. I will upload the chat as well as the video, because Katie's provided lots of links there, which would be really helpful to people. And if Paul, as a refurbishment contractor, he's probably overly busy as it is anyway, but if he wants to put his details in, and if anyone wants to get in touch with him, I'm sure it sounds like he knows what he's doing. And he was just talking about how a proactive heritage consultant is worth their weight in gold. So I might get my son to try and to be one of those, because it must be quite easy to get a job nowadays. You just got, there's so many with the skill shortage. So yeah, no, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. Hell of a lot of information there. I'll upload this video today or tomorrow, and yeah, I'll be in touch actually, see whether we could do a follow-up session and any suggested tangents that we go down, because there's clearly a lot to discuss. We had a good turnout, so thank you to everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your days. Cheers, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.